I didn't say a word when she slid the envelope across the table. I just looked at it, then looked at her, and smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows how a story ends. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what that envelope meant, and why what happened next in front of 63 people who had come to celebrate my birthday changed everything for everyone sitting in that room. My name is Walter, and I built Hendrix hardware with my bare hands, not a metaphor. Actual bare hands, a second-hand truck, and a lease on a failing storefront on Clement Street that the previous owner had let go to seed. That was 1987. Ronald Reagan was president. My wife Carol was pregnant with our son Daniel, and I had $4,000 saved from 3 years of working at a lumber yard in Modesto. $4,000 and enough stubbornness to outlast anyone who told me I was making a mistake. Carol was the one who believed in me first. She always said she married a man who didn't know how to quit, and she meant it as a compliment, though there were Saturday mornings when the books didn't balance and the kids needed new shoes that I could see. It cost her something to keep saying it. She never stopped, not once in 31 years of marriage. When she passed ovarian cancer, 3 days after Thanksgiving, 2019, the store was the only thing I knew how to hold on to. I'd open at 7, stay until 6, eat dinner at the counter where she used to sit and read while I did inventory. It wasn't healthy. My doctor told me that. My sister told me that. But grief is not a reasonable thing, and reasonable advice doesn't touch it. Daniel was the one who finally got through to me. He came in on a Tuesday morning in February of 2020, sat down on the same stool his mother used to sit on, and said, "Dad, she's not here anymore, but you are. You need to start living like it." He didn't say it mean. He said it the way his mother would have said it, direct, without cruelty, with enough love behind it that it landed instead of just bouncing off the wall I'd built around myself. I looked at my son, who had Carol's eyes, and my stubbornness, and I cried for the first time since the funeral. We stayed there for 2 hours. He was 32 years old and wiser than I deserved. That was Daniel. Renee came into his life about 8 months later. She was attractive in a precise way, the kind of woman who seemed like she had been assembled from a catalog of appealing features rather than grown into herself. She had a quick laugh that I initially mistook for warmth, and a way of listening that I initially mistook for interest. She asked me questions about the store, about the neighborhood, about the history of the building. She asked me what the property was worth. I told her I'd never thought about it in those terms. She smiled and said that was charming. I should have paid more attention to that smile. Daniel married her 14 months after they met. I stood at the front of that church and watched my son's face, and whatever doubts I had about Renee, I set them aside when I saw how happy he looked. Carol would have told me to trust my instincts. I told myself she would have told me to support my son. I don't know which version of Carol I invented that day, but I chose the one that let me smile and mean it. They moved into the house 3 blocks from the store, the house Carol and I had bought in 1994, the house Daniel grew up in. I'd offered it to them when I moved into the smaller place on Arbor after Carol died. It made sense. The house was too big for one person, and Daniel had talked about wanting to start a family. Renee walked through every room twice before she said yes, which I thought was thorough at the time. The first year was fine. The second year, things began to surface. It started small. Renee began stopping by the store, which I welcomed at first. She'd ask questions about the business, not casual questions, but specific ones. Margin on lumber, whether I'd considered the commercial zoning variance on the adjacent lot, whether I had a succession plan. I told her the store was doing well, that I had 2 long-term employees who knew the operation, and that I wasn't in any hurry to make decisions about what came next. She nodded and changed the subject. She was good at changing the subject. Then Daniel started having the same conversations. Not suspiciously at first, he'd ask how I was thinking about retirement, whether I'd spoken to an estate attorney, whether I'd considered what made the most sense from a tax perspective. I answered honestly. I'd spoken to my attorney, Jim Kaufman, 2 years earlier. Everything was in order. The store was mine. The building was mine. And when the time came, Daniel would inherit what I intended him to inherit. Renee thinks you should have a formal plan, Daniel said one afternoon. I have a formal plan, I told him. She means documented, written down, a formal transfer. I looked at my son and chose my words carefully. Daniel, everything is documented. Jim has copies of everything. You don't need to worry about this. He looked relieved, which told me the conversation had not been his idea. Over the next several months, the pressure changed shape but not direction. Renee began mentioning a business consultant. She knew a friend from her MBA program who specialized in family business transitions. She mentioned a developer who was interested in the Clement Street corridor. She mentioned twice that property values in that neighborhood had increased significantly since 1987. She never said anything direct. She was too careful for that. But the shape of what she wanted became clearer each time. The way a photograph develops in a dark room slowly. Then all at once. I want to be fair to her here, because fairness is something I believe in even when it's inconvenient. I don't know exactly what Renee wanted. I know what her actions suggested. Maybe she genuinely thought she was being practical. Maybe she looked at a 63-year-old widower with a hardware store and a building worth considerably more than its contents and saw inefficiency where I saw my life's work. People have a remarkable capacity for redefining what they want as what's logical. What I know for certain is what she did at my birthday party. My 63rd birthday fell on a Saturday in April. Daniel had organized a dinner at Magnolia Room, a private dining space above an Italian restaurant on Geary. 63 people, close friends, the neighbors I'd known for decades, my sister Ruth and her husband from Sacramento, two of my oldest employees, Jim Kaufman and his wife. Daniel had strung lights along the ceiling beams and found photographs from the store's opening day and had them printed and framed along one wall. There was a picture of Carol and me standing in front of the store, 22 years old and 20 years old, grinning like we'd already won. I spent the first hour in a state of simple gratitude. It is a rare thing to look around a room and feel genuinely loved, and I tried to hold on to that feeling the way you hold on to the last warmth of a fire when the wood is running low. Ruth gave a toast that made everyone cry a little. My employee Marcus, who has worked for me for 19 years, told a story about the time I refused to close during a power outage because a contractor needed supplies to finish a job and couldn't wait. People laughed. Daniel put his arm around my shoulders and said he was proud of me. Renee sat at the far end of the table and watched all of this with an expression I can only describe as patient. After the main course was cleared, and before dessert came out, she stood up. I remember thinking she was going to give a toast. I remember watching Daniel's face for his reaction and seeing something complicated there, not surprise, not quite, but a look I recognize now as the look of a man who has been told to stay quiet. She reached into the bag hanging on the back of her chair and removed a manila envelope. She walked the length of the table, 63 people watching her, some already sensing something was wrong from the silence. From the way Daniel had gone very still, and she set it down in front of me. "We've had several conversations about the future of the business," she said. Her voice was measured, practiced. "Daniel and I have done a lot of thinking about what makes sense for this family, and we've had some documents prepared. Tonight seemed like the right time." I looked at the envelope. I did not touch it. "What is this?" I asked. "It's a deed transfer. Hendricks Hardware and the building on Clement Street transferred to a joint LLC we've set up. You'd remain involved as long as you want to be. It just formalizes the transition and protects everyone's interests." The room was absolutely silent. I am not a man who raises his voice. I learned that from Carol. Actually, she had a way of getting quieter as situations became more serious, and I'd absorbed it without realizing it over 30 years. So when I speak of what happened next, understand that my voice did not change in volume, only in temperature. "You brought legal documents to my birthday party," I said. Like I said, it seemed like a good time to, in front of my friends, my sister, my employees. I paused. The people who have been part of my life for 30 years. "Walter, this isn't meant to be confrontational. It's just, did my son know you were going to do this tonight?" The pause before she answered told me everything. We discussed it. I looked at Daniel. He looked at the table. That moment, watching my son look at the table instead of at me, was the sharpest pain of the evening. Not anger, pain. I stood up. I am not a large man, but I am not a small one either, And I have the posture of someone who has spent 40 years lifting and carrying and building. I stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he has made a decision that he has no intention of reversing. I'm going to step outside for a few minutes, I said. I said it to the room, not to Renee. Please enjoy the dessert. I'll be back. I heard Ruth say my name as I walked toward the door. I heard the sound of a chair being pushed back, Daniel, I thought. Too late. I walked through the restaurant, past the bar, out onto Geary Street where the April air was cool and smelled like the city I had lived in for 40 years. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. I called Jim Kaufman. He answered on the third ring, which meant he'd seen my name and chosen to pick up even though he'd been sitting 20 feet away from me an hour ago. Jim has been my attorney since 1991. He handled the deed to the building, the incorporation of the business, Carol's estate, and every significant legal decision I had made for 32 years. He is also the only person outside of this story who knew what I had done 6 months earlier. She brought the documents tonight, I said. A pause. Then, I see. She brought them to the birthday dinner, in front of everyone. Another pause. Walter, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Tell me we're ready. We've been ready since October. I thanked him. I stood on Geary Street for another 3 minutes, watching a couple argue quietly at the bus stop across the street, watching a dog pull against its leash, watching the ordinary world continue its ordinary business. Then I went back inside. Renee was still standing at the end of the table. The envelope was still in front of my empty chair. Daniel had not moved. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I looked at my daughter-in-law. Renee, I said, I'd like to explain something to you. She started to speak. I held up one hand, very gently, and she stopped. 6 months ago, I finalized a transfer of Hendricks Hardware and the Clement Street building into an irrevocable trust. The trust is administered by Jim Kaufman and names Daniel as the sole beneficiary upon my death or incapacity, with specific provisions preventing the sale or transfer of the property for 20 years without the unanimous consent of a 3-person advisory board. That board consists of Jim, my sister Ruth, and Marcus Webb. I nodded toward Marcus, who sat very still at the far end of the table. The transfer was recorded with the county in October. Whatever is in that envelope has no legal effect on anything. Renee's expression did not collapse all at once. It changed the way a building changes in an earthquake. Small things first, the objects falling off shelves, then the larger structure becoming uncertain. What? She said. The store and the building are in trust. They cannot be sold, transferred, or leveraged without the consent of all 3 trustees. Not by me, not by Daniel, not by anyone. She looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at me now, not at the table. His face held something I had not expected. Not anger, something that looked around the edges like relief. You can't just, she started. I can, I said. I did, several months ago, when I began to feel that certain conversations about my business were happening more often than I was comfortable with. I spoke with Jim and made appropriate arrangements. Everything is legal, properly recorded, and final. The room was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. The silence of 63 people holding their breath for different reasons. Renee picked up the envelope from the table. She looked at it. Then she looked at me with an expression that had passed through several phases and arrived at something cold. Daniel should have been part of that decision, she said. Daniel is the beneficiary of that decision, I replied. He will inherit everything I built, protected, intact, and free from any obligation he didn't choose for himself. I watched her process this. I watched the architecture of her plan rearrange itself in real time, looking for a door that wasn't there. There is something almost pitiable in that moment, when a person realizes that every move they've been calculating for has already been accounted for. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired and sad, and grateful for Jim Kaufman's thoroughness. This isn't over, she said. She said it quietly, which was more unsettling than if she had said it loudly. I think it is, I replied. She picked up her bag, replaced the envelope inside it, and walked out of the magnolia room. The sound of her heels on the hardwood floor was very clear in the silence. What happened next I was not prepared for. Daniel stood up. He stood up, and for a moment I didn't know what he was going to do, whether he was going to follow her out, whether he was going to turn to me with something in his face I wouldn't be able to recover from. But he didn't do either of those things. He walked down the length of the table, the same path Renee had walked 10 minutes earlier, and he stopped in front of me. He put his arms around me the way he hadn't since his mother's funeral. He was shaking slightly. I could feel it through the fabric of his jacket. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. I should have said something. I should have told you." I held on to my son. He was 35 years old, and he had his mother's eyes, and he smelled the same way he had when he was 7 and came in from playing outside. I held on to him for a long time. "You're here now," I said. That was enough. That was everything. Ruth started crying. Someone, I think it was Marcus, started a very quiet, uncertain round of applause that grew until the whole room was applauding, which would have been absurd in any other context, but felt, in that moment, like the exact right thing. The dessert came out. People ate it. The conversation slowly came back to life the way a garden comes back after a hard frost, tentatively, in patches, then all at once. Ruth sat beside me and held my hand for the last hour of the evening. Jim Kaufman raised his glass from across the table and nodded, and I nodded back. It was the best birthday I'd had in years. In the weeks that followed, things moved in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I had prepared for the legal reality. I had not fully prepared for the human one. Daniel and Renee separated 6 weeks after the birthday dinner. He told me about it on a Sunday morning, at the counter of the store, on the same stool his mother used to sit on. He said it quietly and without drama, the way he said most important things. He said that the birthday dinner had made something clear to him that he had been choosing not to see. He said that he had known for a long time that Renee's interest in the store had been a kind of pressure, and had told himself it was practical, financial, reasonable, all the words reasonable people use to avoid uncomfortable truths. She asked me, on our third date, what the building on Clement Street was worth, he said. I looked at my coffee. I told myself it was just curiosity, he said. Smart woman, interested in business. I wanted her to be that. We see what we want to see, I told him. He nodded. Mom used to say that to me. She was right about most things. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, Did you know? Before the party? I thought about how to answer honestly. I had concerns, I said. I didn't have certainty. The trust wasn't only about Renee. I'd been meaning to set it up for years. But I won't pretend her questions didn't accelerate the timeline. He nodded again, slowly. I'm glad you did. I reached across the counter and put my hand on my son's arm. He was 35 years old and had just made the hardest decision of his life, and he was sitting in the place where his mother used to sit. And the morning light was coming through the front window the way it always had, and the store smelled the way it always had, wood and metal and motor oil and the faint sweetness of sawdust. And I thought about everything I had built and why I had built it and what it had been for. Jim Kaufman called me the following week with additional news I had not expected. During the preparation of the deed transfer documents, the ones Renee had brought to the party, her attorney had made an error that escalated significantly upon review. The documents had been prepared using a fraudulent appraisal that significantly undervalued the property, and the LLC structure Renee had set up contained provisions that would have given her unilateral control over asset decisions, while appearing on paper to be a joint arrangement with Daniel. Jim had flagged these issues to the county recorder's office and to the state bar. I will not detail the full legal aftermath here because some of it is still ongoing. But I will say that the attorney who prepared those documents no longer practices in California, and that Renee's financial exposure from the civil proceedings is significant. I did not pursue these things out of anger. I want to be clear about that. I pursued them because the law exists for a reason, and because the same principle that led me to set up the trust that a thing built honestly should be protected, honestly applied to what came after. You build something with integrity. You defend it with integrity. That is not revenge. That is just completion. There is a morning I want to tell you about, because it matters to me more than the legal details, more than the trust documents, more than the expression on Renee's face when she heard the word irrevocable. It was a Thursday in June, about 10 weeks after the birthday dinner. I opened the store at 7, the way I always do. The morning light on Clement Street in June is particular. It comes in at an angle that catches the dust in the air and makes the whole block look like it's been gilded. I stood in the doorway for a moment, the way I'd stood in that same doorway for 36 years, and I thought about the morning Carol and I had opened this place for the first time. The two of us alone in an empty store with $4,000 and a set of keys that didn't fit the back lock. And we had to call a locksmith who charged us $40, which felt like a catastrophe at the time. Daniel pulled up at 7:15. He got out of his truck with 2 coffees from the place on 6th and walked up to where I was standing and handed me one without a word. We stood in the doorway together. I am 63 years old. My son is 35. We have the same stubbornness and different eyes. I was thinking, he said, about that expansion on the adjacent lot, the zoning variance that comes up next year. I looked at him. I thought that was Renee's idea. It was a good idea, he said, just for the wrong reasons. I thought about that. I thought about the difference between an idea and the motive behind it, and whether an idea could be reclaimed the way a piece of land can be reclaimed after a flood cleared of the damage, restored to what it was always supposed to be. Tell me what you're thinking, I said. He started talking. He talked about square footage and inventory and a workshop space in the back, where we could run classes for contractors, for homeowners, learning basic repair, for the kind of people who used to come in and ask me to just explain something, not just sell them the part. He talked about it the way I used to talk about the store when I was his age, with the energy of someone who had found a thing worth building. I listened. The June light came down Clement Street and found the dust in the air and made everything golden, the way it does. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck was backing up, making that sound they make. A woman walked by with a stroller and nodded at us, and we nodded back. It's a good idea, I said when he finished. He smiled. He has his mother's smile, which I have always been grateful for, because I see her in it. We went inside. He took the counter while I went through the morning invoices. Around 8 o'clock, Marcus arrived and started on the delivery inventory, moving with the ease of 19 years of the same rhythms in the same space. Around 8:30, the first customer of the day came in, a contractor I'd known for 20 years named Pete, who needed half-inch copper fittings and always pretended to be in a hurry but stayed to talk for 22 minutes. It was an ordinary morning in a place I had built. My son was standing behind the counter where his mother used to sit. The trust document was on file with the County of San Francisco. The building on Clement Street, which I had leased in 1987 for $900 a month and purchased in 1993 and renovated in 2001 and re-roofed in 2015 and painted by hand twice, with Carol holding the ladder, was protected and intact and would remain so. I have been asked, since that birthday party, whether I was angry, whether I felt betrayed, whether I wanted more consequences than the ones that came. I have thought carefully about how to answer honestly. I was not angry. I was clear. There is a difference between those two things that takes most of a lifetime to understand. Anger is hot, and it moves fast, and it makes decisions that look like strength but are often just fear wearing a different coat. Clarity is cooler. It waits. It prepares. It makes a call to Jim Kaufman on a Tuesday in October and files the right documents with the right office, and then attends its own birthday dinner without saying a word about any of it, and smiles the smile of a man who already knows how a story ends. Carol taught me that. She had more of it than I ever did. I have spent 5 years since losing her, trying to grow into the clarity she modeled for 31 years, and I am not done growing. I don't expect to be. But I know this. I built Hendrix Hardware on Clement Street in the outer Richmond neighborhood of San Francisco with $4,000 and a truck and a woman who believed in me when I barely believed in myself. I built it through recessions and a pandemic and a grief I did not think I would survive. I built it for a son who has his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and who stood in the doorway with me on a June morning and talked about a workshop space in the back, with the energy of someone who had found a thing worth building. That is the story. It is not a story about revenge. It is a story about what you do when someone tries to take what you built. and whether the way you respond is worthy of what you were protecting. I think it was. I think Carol would have thought so too. The wine at my birthday dinner, Jim had brought a bottle of a California Pinot Noir I'd never tried before, was very good. I didn't notice it much at the time. A few days later, I bought another bottle from the shop on California Street and opened it at home, alone at the kitchen table, and paid attention to it the way you pay attention to something after the emergency has passed and you have the space to be present. It was warm and a little smoky, and underneath it there was something that reminded me of the smell of the store after a long day, wood and work, and something that had been built and tended and was still, in spite of everything, exactly where it was supposed to be. I sat with that for a while. Then I washed the glass, set it on the drying rack the way Carol always did, and went to bed. In the morning I opened the store at 7. Daniel came by at 8 with coffee. Marcus arrived at 8:30. The first customer of the day came in needing copper fittings. We were open for business.